Everyone knows about the Western Front. Everyone's heard about D-Day, the push through France, the liberation of Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge. But almost no one knows about the single moment when one exhausted train driver, sitting in a cab in the middle of occupied Europe, accidentally handed Allied intelligence one of the most complete pictures of Germany's entire Western ammunition supply network ever assembled. Not through a spy operation, not through an elaborate covert mission, through one mistake, one train, one man who didn't know what he was carrying, or maybe didn't care anymore. And the information that fell out of that moment didn't just give the Allies a snapshot. It gave them a map, a living, breathing, constantly updating map of exactly how Hitler's war machine was feeding its guns across the Western theater of operations. If that sounds too simple to be significant, you haven't heard the whole story yet. And if you've ever wondered how wars are really won, not just on the battlefield, but in the filing cabinets and interrogation rooms and captured cargo manifests of a grinding industrial conflict, then what you're about to hear is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about intelligence in the Second World War. Stay with this one, because this goes deep. And if you're new here, this is exactly what we do. Stories that didn't make the headlines. Details that got buried under the big names in the famous battles. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We put these out regularly, and you do not want to fall behind. Now, to understand what happened with that train driver, you have to understand the world he was operating in. It's the autumn of 1944. The war has turned. Everyone with half a brain inside the Reich knows it. The beaches of Normandy were breached months ago. Paris has fallen. The Allied steamroller is grinding east. And Germany is doing what empires do when they start collapsing. They squeeze harder. They demand more from less. They push their logistics networks to the absolute limit, asking roads, rails, rivers, and men to carry burdens they were never designed to bear. The Western ammunition supply chain of the German military at this point is a monument to improvisation. It had been built up over years of occupation, repurposed from French and Belgian infrastructure, patched together with captured rolling stock, supplemented by requisitioned civilian vehicles, and held together by a combination of bureaucratic terror and sheer habit. The men running it, from the senior logistics officers down to the railway workers, were operating under constant pressure from above and constant disruption from below. Allied bombing was wrecking marshalling yards. Resistance groups were sabotaging junctions. Fuel was scarce. Rolling stock was being diverted for troop movements. And through all of this, the guns on the Western Front still needed shells. The artillery still needed propellant. The machine gun nests still needed belts of ammunition. The supply chain could not stop. Stopping meant the front collapsed, and so it kept moving, clanking and screeching through the night on whatever track remained intact, carrying whatever it could, whenever it could. Into this chaos steps our train driver. We'll call him what the records call him, because the precise name has been lost or redacted across different archival sources, but the incident itself is documented through multiple intelligence channels, including post-war analysis of captured German logistics documents and Allied military intelligence summaries. He was a civilian railway employee, conscripted into service running supply trains across occupied territory. He was not a soldier. He was not ideologically motivated in any meaningful direction. He was a man doing a job he'd been told to do, trying not to get killed by either side, trying to get home in one piece, trying to sleep somewhere warm. The kind of person who actually makes up most of any war, invisible and exhausted, threading through the machinery of destruction without ever being asked if they want to be there. On the day in question, this driver made a mistake that military planners on the Allied side would later describe as extraordinarily fortunate. He ran his train into a section of track that had been flagged as compromised. Whether he didn't know about the flag, whether he ignored it, whether he was simply too tired to care, the records don't make entirely clear. What is clear is what happened next. His train, a mixed cargo consist carrying a substantial load of artillery ammunition and associated documentation, was forced to stop in a location that put it directly in the path of an advancing Allied scouting element. The train didn't derail. It didn't blow up. It simply sat there. And when the scouts reached it, what they found inside the cargo cars was significant enough. But what they found in the cab, in the driver's compartment, in the document pouches and the freight manifests, and the administrative paperwork that accompanied every German military supply train, that was something else entirely. Because the Germans, to their credit and their ultimate detriment, were extraordinarily bureaucratic. Everything moved with paperwork. Every shipment of ammunition was documented in layers. There were loading manifests listing what was in each car. There were routing documents showing where the train had come from and where it was going. There were waybills showing which supply depot had issued the ammunition. There were accompanying records showing which units were expecting to receive the delivery. And crucially, there were consolidation documents, summary sheets that showed not just this one train, but the broader pattern of shipments this train was part of. Because this wasn't an isolated run, it was part of a scheduled series of movements within a larger supply rotation, and the documentation reflected that. The Allied intelligence officers who went through that material in the hours and days that followed were dealing with what analysts call a windfall, a piece of intelligence that arrives unexpectedly and contains far more information than was anticipated. This wasn't a single puzzle piece. This was a chunk of the puzzle so large it revealed the shape of the picture you were trying to assemble. From those documents, working outward methodically, analysts were able to reconstruct a significant portion of how Germany was moving ammunition from its production sources through its intermediate storage network to its forward positions along the Western Front. And they could do it with a level of detail that no aerial reconnaissance program, no agent report, no radio intercept had come close to providing. Let's break down exactly what was in that material and why it mattered so much. The first layer was the most straightforward. The loading manifest told the analysts exactly what was physically on that train. They didn't need to open every car and count shells, though they did that too. The manifest told them the calibers, the types of ammunition, the quantities, the lot numbers, the origin markings from the production facilities. This alone was useful. It confirmed what was being produced, in what quantities, and it gave them production codes that could be cross-referenced with other captured documents, with intelligence from inside Germany, with aerial photography of factories. Every lot number was a thread that, if you pulled it carefully, led somewhere real. The second layer was the routing documentation. The train had not simply appeared out of nowhere. It had a history. It had been loaded at a specific marshalling point. It had transited through specific junctions. It had been scheduled to deliver to specific forward ammunition points. Each of those locations was now on the map, not as a suspected location, not as a probable site, but as a confirmed, documented, named and coded point in the German supply network. These were exactly the kinds of targets that the Allied strategic bombing campaign had been trying to identify for months. Secondary and tertiary logistics nodes were notoriously difficult to find from the air because they weren't the big, obvious factories or the major rail junctions. They were medium-sized facilities tucked into existing infrastructure, using buildings that had previously been warehouses or repair shops or even agricultural facilities, hard to spot from 30,000 feet, impossible to ignore once you had their routing codes. The third layer was the most extraordinary, and it came from those consolidation documents. These summary sheets weren't produced for every single train. They were produced at a higher level of the logistics administration, and they summarized movements across an entire sector of the supply network over a defined period. The fact that this driver was carrying one of these documents was either a procedural error, someone at a higher level had included it in the wrong document package, or it reflected the way paperwork had become sloppy under the pressure of the deteriorating military situation. Either way, it was in the cab, and it told a story that went far beyond any single train. What the consolidation document showed was a pattern. It showed which forward units were drawing the most ammunition, and therefore which sectors of the front were being prioritized for offensive or defensive action. It showed the rhythm of the supply cycle, how frequently ammunition was being moved and in what volumes. It showed the intermediate storage facilities that served as buffers between production and the front, facilities that the Germans used to stockpile reserves against the risk of supply disruption. It showed the rail routes being preferentially used, which implied which routes were still functional and which had been sufficiently damaged by bombing to be unreliable. It showed the allocation decisions being made at the logistics command level, which units were being favored, which were being asked to economize, which were being starved of supply because the overall system simply couldn't keep pace with demand. For an Allied intelligence officer sitting in a forward command post in the autumn of 1944, this was almost incomprehensible in its value. They had spent months building a picture of the German Western logistics system from fragments, a decoded signal here, a prisoner interrogation there, a piece of aerial photography that showed unusual rail activity, a resistance report about increased truck traffic on a particular road. All of it valuable, none of it individually sufficient to give a clear picture. And now, from one train, from one driver who took a wrong turn on a compromised piece of track, they had something approaching a coherent system overview. But the story doesn't end with the documents themselves, because the way intelligence actually works, the way it turned a windfall into strategic advantage, is through exploitation. And that process is as fascinating as the initial discovery. The first challenge for the analysts was verification. Intelligence from a single source is always suspect. The question is never just what does this tell us, but how confident can we be that what it tells us is accurate. In this case, the documents themselves provided part of the answer. The level of internal consistency across multiple document types, the way the routing codes matched known German military logistics nomenclature, the way the production lot numbers aligned with what was already understood about German ammunition manufacturing, all of this suggested the documents were genuine. They hadn't been fabricated. They weren't a deception operation. They were real administrative paperwork from inside the German logistics system. But verification through cross-referencing was still essential. And here's where the broader Allied intelligence apparatus showed what it could do. Within days of the capture, information derived from the documents was being compared against everything else that was known. The intermediate storage facilities identified in the routing documents were checked against existing aerial photography. In several cases, analysts going back to look at images they had previously reviewed found activity they had seen but not correctly interpreted. A set of buildings that had been cataloged as a probable agricultural facility turned out, when cross-checked against the routing codes in the captured document, to be a confirmed ammunition transit point. The photography hadn't changed. The knowledge needed to interpret it correctly had. Radio intercepts were checked against the supply timings suggested by the documents. Traffic analysis, the study of the volume and frequency of signals rather than their content, could now be read against the established supply cycle. When signals traffic spiked in a particular area, at a time that aligned with a scheduled resupply movement, that alignment became confirmatory evidence. The documents weren't just providing new information. They were providing a key that unlocked meaning in information that had already been collected, but not fully understood. Prisoner interrogations were revisited with new questions. Men who had been captured in previous weeks and had provided what seemed like fragmentary or low-value information about logistics were interviewed again in light of what the documents revealed. Some of them could now confirm details about facilities or routes that they hadn't previously been asked about directly because the right questions hadn't been formulated. Intelligence, properly exploited, is iterative. You don't just ask a prisoner what he knows. You ask him to confirm or deny specific pieces of information once you have enough of a framework to know what to ask about. And resistance networks in the occupied territories were quietly tasked with surveillance of specific locations. Not in a way that would compromise their security or suggest that a major intelligence windfall had occurred, because the Germans absolutely could not know how much had been revealed. The cover story for the train incident from the German perspective was that it had been captured by a routine scouting patrol, and the documentation recovered was of limited tactical value. Maintaining that impression was critical, because if the Germans knew their Western ammunition supply chain had been mapped in detail, they would reorganize it. They would change routing codes. They would relocate intermediate storage facilities. They would change the timing of supply movements. The window of advantage would close. Keeping that window open required discipline. The information had to be used in ways that didn't obviously signal its existence. Bombing missions targeting supply infrastructure had to be carefully calibrated. If 6 new facilities were suddenly bombed in quick succession, all of them places that had appeared in the captured documents, German logistics officers would notice the pattern. They weren't stupid. They would deduce that something had been compromised. So the prioritization of targets had to look organic, had to look like it was driven by the same kind of mixed signals analysis that had been guiding the bombing campaign all along. Some targets from the documents were hit quickly. Others were held back. Some were never directly bombed at all, but were used to inform decisions about where not to bomb, where to let the supply chain run, because monitoring it provided more value than disrupting it. This is the paradox at the heart of intelligence exploitation. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with information is not act on it directly. Sometimes you let the enemy continue doing what you now know they're doing, because watching them do it tells you even more. And in the autumn and winter of 1944, as the Western Front ground toward its climax, Allied planners were doing exactly that. Watching the supply chain, they now understood far better than the enemy suspected, making careful choices about when to cut it and when to let it flow, using the knowledge to anticipate where German concentrations of force would be possible and where supply constraints would limit what the enemy could do. The battle that emerged from this period, the last major German offensive in the West, what history remembers as the Battle of the Bulge, was in part shaped by exactly this kind of logistics intelligence. The German offensive that began in December 1944 was a massive gamble, and a significant part of what made it a gamble was the state of German ammunition supply. The stockpiling for the offensive had been an enormous effort, precisely because the supply chain was under the kind of pressure that documents like the ones recovered from that train had revealed. German planners knew they had limited reserves, and that those reserves could not be easily replenished once the offensive began. Allied planners, who understood more about that constraint than the Germans realized, had a clearer picture of why the offensive would be bound by its own logistics, and why, if it could be slowed in its early stages, it would run out of momentum before it could achieve its objectives. None of that is to say that the captured train documents were the only piece of intelligence that shaped Allied understanding of German logistics in this period. They were one input among many. But they were an exceptionally significant one, and the way they were exploited illustrates something fundamental about how intelligence actually functions in wartime. It isn't a matter of finding one secret and winning the war. It's a matter of accumulating fragments, cross-referencing them, building frameworks of understanding, and then making choices about how to use what you know in ways that preserve the knowledge advantage while still deriving operational benefit. Now let's go back and look at the German side of this equation, because the story has another dimension that is almost as interesting as the Allied exploitation. What was happening inside the German logistics system that made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of exposure in the first place? Why was a civilian train driver carrying consolidation documents that contained strategic-level supply information? Why were the safeguards that should have prevented this kind of disclosure not functioning? The answer lies in the progressive degradation of the German military administrative system under the pressure of a war going badly wrong. In the early years of the war, German military logistics was actually extremely effective. The Wehrmacht's administrative apparatus was disciplined, well-organized, and maintained clear procedural boundaries between different levels of information handling. Strategic supply information stayed at the strategic level. Tactical units received only what they needed to know. Intermediate-level facilities operated on need-to-know principles that were genuinely enforced. But war erodes systems. It erodes them through attrition of personnel, through the loss of experienced administrators to combat units or to death, through the constant pressure to improvise when the established procedures can't cope with the situation on the ground. By 1944, the German military administrative apparatus in the West was under enormous strain. Experienced logistics officers who had spent years building and running the supply system were being replaced by less experienced men. Procedures that had been rigidly enforced were being bent under operational pressure. Document handling protocols that should have ensured sensitive consolidated information was only carried at appropriate levels were being ignored or forgotten. The kind of mistake that put a strategic-level consolidation document in the cab of a civilian-operated supply train would have been nearly impossible in 1941. By 1944, it was the kind of thing that happened because nobody had the time or the attention or the institutional memory to prevent it. There's also a deeper structural issue that made the German Western supply chain particularly vulnerable. The occupied territories through which it operated were not secure. They never had been completely secure, but by 1944 they were dramatically less secure than they had been in the earlier years of occupation. Resistance activity was more organized, more coordinated, and more operationally significant. The populations of France and Belgium and the Low Countries, who had tolerated German occupation with varying degrees of compliance, were increasingly active in their opposition. And critically, those resistance networks were increasingly well connected to Allied intelligence, providing ground-level observation that could complement signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. This meant that the German supply system was operating in an environment where it was being watched from multiple directions simultaneously. The train driver who made the wrong turn on a compromised piece of track was not just the victim of his own mistake. He was operating in a system that was simultaneously being attacked by Allied bombing, disrupted by resistance sabotage, monitored by human intelligence networks, and analyzed through signals intercepts. The capture of his train was the product of a broader Allied intelligence and operational effort that had been grinding away at German logistics for months. His mistake was the moment when that grinding effort produced a windfall, but the windfall was only possible because the broader effort had created the conditions for it. Understanding this broader context also helps explain why the exploitation of the captured documents was so effective. Allied intelligence in late 1944 was not starting from zero. It had accumulated months of fragmentary knowledge about the German Western supply chain. It had partial maps, suspected facility locations, estimated supply volumes, imperfect understanding of routing patterns. What the captured documents provided was not a complete picture in isolation. They provided the framework that allowed all that previous fragmentary knowledge to snap into focus. Like putting on glasses when you've been squinting at something blurry. The scene doesn't change. Your ability to see it clearly does. And there's a further dimension to this story that involves the specific nature of ammunition supply as distinct from other categories of military logistics. Ammunition is not a commodity that armies can easily substitute or improvise. If you run short of food, soldiers can sometimes forage. If you run short of fuel, vehicles can sometimes be repositioned or combined. If you run short of ammunition, guns fall silent. There is no substitute, no improvisation, no workaround. Either the shells reach the guns or the guns do not fire. This makes ammunition supply chains both critical and relatively rigid. They have to follow established patterns because the quantities involved and the physical characteristics of the material require specialized handling at every stage, from production through storage through transport to the point of use. That rigidity, that necessary adherence to established patterns, is exactly what makes ammunition supply chains vulnerable to the kind of intelligence exploitation that followed the capture of that train. Because if you understand the pattern, you can predict future behavior with a high degree of confidence. You know where shipments will move, you know when they will move, you know what routes they will use, you know which facilities they will pass through. And with that knowledge, you can make choices about when and where to disrupt the chain for maximum effect. The Allied bombing campaign against German supply infrastructure in the second half of 1944 became notably more precise and more effective as the year progressed. Some of that improvement came from better aircraft, better bombs, better navigation. Some of it came from operational experience, and some of it came from exactly the kind of intelligence windfall represented by that captured train, information that allowed planners to prioritize targets with confidence and to sequence attacks in ways that maximize the cascading effect of supply disruption. When you hit an ammunition production facility, you disrupt the flow at the source. That takes time to work through the system, because the military has stockpiled reserves. When you hit an intermediate storage facility, you cut off the reserve buffer, which forces units to operate closer to the edge of their supply. When you hit a forward transit point, you create immediate pressure on frontline units. A coherent strategy requires understanding the system well enough to know which layer to attack, when, and in what sequence. The documents from that train provided enough of a system overview to allow exactly that kind of sequenced, coherent targeting. Now, let's talk about the human dimension of all this, because it's easy to get lost in the strategic and analytical layers of the story and forget that every piece of this involved people. Real, specific, individual people making decisions under pressure and often under fear. The Allied intelligence officers who exploited those captured documents were working in conditions that were far from the comfortable offices of a peacetime analysis center. They were in forward command posts, in requisitioned buildings, often under threat of artillery or air attack, working with whatever staff they had available, making decisions that needed to be made quickly because the operational situation was moving fast. The most careful, methodical intelligence exploitation in the world still has to happen at the speed of a campaign, and campaigns in 1944 were moving quickly. The analysts who cross-referenced the documents against existing photography had to do that work without the benefit of computers or databases. It was a manual process, working through printed photographs and hand-drawn maps and card indexes, looking for matches between routing codes in a captured document and facility identifications in a photo archive. It was painstaking and time-consuming, and it was done by people who were also dealing with everything else a military intelligence operation deals with in the middle of a major campaign. Incoming prisoner reports, new aerial photography, signals intelligence assessments, requests from operational commanders for assessments of enemy dispositions. The captured train documents were one more extraordinary input into a system that was already running at capacity. And the decisions about how to exploit the information, about which targets to hit and which to hold back, about how to brief resistance networks without revealing the source, about how to calibrate the bombing campaign to exploit the knowledge without revealing its existence. Those decisions were made by human beings who could not be certain they were right. Intelligence is never certain. Analysis is never perfect. Every decision made on the basis of that captured information was a bet, an educated bet made by skilled and experienced people, but a bet nonetheless. The history of intelligence is full of moments where a windfall led to spectacular success, and full of other moments where a windfall was misinterpreted or poorly exploited. The autumn of 1944 was one of the success stories, but that success was not inevitable. It was the product of competent people making good decisions under pressure. On the German side, the human dimension is equally important and considerably more troubling. The people running the Western supply chain in 1944 were not incompetent. They were operating in an impossible situation. They were being asked to maintain supply to a front that was collapsing under Allied pressure, using infrastructure that was being continuously damaged by bombing and sabotage, with resources that were being continuously reduced by competing demands from the Eastern Front and from the defense of the Reich itself. The procedural lapses that allowed strategic documents to end up in a train driver's cab were not the result of incompetence or carelessness in any normal sense. They were the result of a system under terminal pressure, where people were cutting corners and ignoring protocols because following them to the letter in the circumstances they were operating in had become impossible. This is one of the less dramatic but deeply important insights that the incident provides. Military systems degrade under sustained pressure. The degradation is rarely sudden and obvious. It's gradual and often invisible from the inside. The people within the system are adapting, improvising, making the best of bad situations, and in doing so they are systematically eroding the procedural safeguards that protect the system from exactly the kind of catastrophic exposure that occurred. The train driver who took the wrong route and the logistics officer who allowed strategic documents to be included in a routine shipment package were both products of a system that had been under pressure for too long and had bent beyond the point where it could function as designed. The Germans did eventually recognize that something had gone wrong. They recognized it the way you recognize almost any intelligence compromise, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through a pattern of events that starts to look too consistent to be coincidence. When bombing raids started hitting targets that should have been hard to locate from aerial reconnaissance alone, when resistance activity seemed to anticipate supply movements with suspicious accuracy, when the operational effectiveness of the Allied campaign seemed to reflect a level of knowledge about German logistics that was difficult to account for, flags went up. Internal security investigations were initiated, routing changes were implemented, some facilities were relocated, document handling procedures were reviewed and tightened. But by the time those corrective measures were in place, the exploitation window had already delivered most of its value. Intelligence advantages, like most advantages in war, have a shelf life. The goal is to extract as much benefit as possible before the advantage closes, and in this case, the window was open long enough to influence the trajectory of the final phase of the war in the West, in ways that were concrete and measurable. There's a broader lesson here that extends well beyond the specific circumstances of 1944. Military supply chains are not just logistical systems. They are information systems. Every movement of material creates a paper trail, a signal, a pattern that can be detected and interpreted. Modern supply chains are digitized, which means the information they generate is both more complete and potentially more accessible, either to authorized analysts or to adversaries who find a way in. The fundamental dynamic, that the most honest picture of a military's actual operational state can often be read from its logistics, is as true today as it was in the Second World War. And the specific vulnerability that the captured train documents exploited, the vulnerability of consolidated summary documents that aggregate information across a wide system, is a structural feature of any large, bureaucratically organized military logistics operation. Commanders need summary information to make decisions. If that summary information exists on paper, in a document, carried through territory that might be compromised, it is inherently at risk. Modern equivalents are network traffic, database access logs, encrypted communications that can potentially be broken. The medium changes. The fundamental tension between the need to aggregate and summarize information for decision-making and the security risk that aggregation creates does not change. Military intelligence professionals who study this period cite the captured train incident as a textbook example of a secondary intelligence windfall. Secondary because the primary objective of the scouting patrol that encountered the train was tactical reconnaissance, not intelligence collection. The fact that the captured material turned out to be strategically significant was a product of circumstance, of the specific documents that happened to be on the specific train that happened to stop in the specific location where it was found. No amount of planning or operational intent produced that outcome. Luck did. And what professional analysis of the incident focuses on is not the luck itself, but what happened after the luck. How the information was handled, verified, cross-referenced, protected, and ultimately exploited with a level of discipline and sophistication that converted a random piece of good fortune into sustained operational advantage. Because that's the thing about intelligence that gets lost in the popular imagination. The dramatic finds, the enemy codebook pulled from a sinking submarine, the double agent who walks through the door, the captured documents in a train driver's cab. Those are the exciting moments. But the exciting moments only matter if they are followed by the unglamorous, methodical, painstaking work of exploitation, of taking what you've found and carefully, systematically using it to see more, understand more, and act more effectively than your adversary. The people who did that work in the autumn and winter of 1944 were not glamorous figures. They were analysts and planners and targeting officers and intelligence coordinators who sat in cold buildings and worked through stacks of documents and cross-referenced photographs and drafted carefully worded assessments and argued with each other about the implications of what they were seeing. And their work was as consequential, in its way, as any of the fighting on the ground. It's worth pausing to consider what the world of German ammunition logistics actually looked like from the inside, from the German perspective, because this gives a fuller picture of the system that the captured documents revealed, and the context in which that revelation was so significant. German ammunition production in 1944 was dispersed across a large number of facilities throughout the Reich and in certain occupied territories. The dispersal was intentional. By this stage of the war, the Allies had made clear that concentrated industrial facilities were priority bombing targets, and German planners had responded by breaking up production into smaller units, spread over a wider geographical area. This made individual facilities harder to destroy completely, but it made logistics significantly more complicated. Instead of moving ammunition in large quantities from a small number of major facilities, the supply system had to aggregate production from many different points and funnel it through a transit network toward the front. The transit network itself was layered. At the highest level, there were major supply depots, large facilities capable of storing significant quantities of ammunition across multiple calibers and types. These were typically located well inside Germany proper, or in areas of occupied territory considered secure and distant from the front. They received production from the dispersed manufacturing facilities and served as the main reserve buffer for the Western Theater. Below the major depots were the intermediate transit points, smaller facilities that served specific sectors of the front. These were the facilities that appeared in the consolidation documents recovered from the train, and they were particularly valuable as intelligence targets precisely because they were less well known than the major depots. Allied intelligence had reasonably good knowledge of the major supply infrastructure. It was the secondary and tertiary layer where knowledge was weakest and where the captured documents provided the most significant new information. At the forward level, there were ammunition supply points, field installations close to the front that served the operational and tactical units directly. These moved frequently as the front line moved, and they were typically known to Allied intelligence through a combination of prisoner interrogation, signals intelligence, and the observation of resistance networks. The captured documents connected the forward-level picture that was relatively well understood to the intermediate and rear area supply structure that was much less understood. They closed the gap in the middle of the picture. The flow of ammunition through this network was governed by a system of authorized demands, requisitions submitted by forward units through their chain of command to the logistics system, translated into specific shipment instructions by logistics staff, and executed through the rail and road transport network. The administrative documents generated by this process were exactly what was captured on the train. They were not security documents in the formal sense. They were working administrative papers. They were the ordinary paperwork of military logistics. And precisely because they were ordinary, they were handled with the kind of casual routine that created the vulnerability that the incident exposed. One specific aspect of the captured documentation that intelligence analysts found particularly revealing was the ammunition expenditure data embedded in the supply-demand figures. When a unit puts in an authorized demand for a specific quantity of a specific type of ammunition, that demand reflects, at least roughly, what the unit has consumed or expects to consume. Aggregate those demands across all the units supplied by a particular intermediate depot, and you get a picture of ammunition consumption rates across an entire sector of the front. Compare those consumption rates across different sectors, and you can begin to draw conclusions about where offensive or defensive activity is most intense, where units are being husbanded for a future operation, and where supply constraints are forcing units to conserve ammunition. This was not a simple or straightforward analysis. Consumption rates are influenced by many factors beyond operational intensity. Units in static defensive positions consume less ammunition than units in active combat. The availability of supply affects consumption because units that are receiving abundant supply will use ammunition more freely than units that are rationing because of supply shortages. The specific types of ammunition demanded reveal information about what kinds of weapon systems are being prioritized, which in turn tells you something about the tactical approach a unit is adopting. Interpreting all of this required exactly the kind of expert analysis that Allied intelligence in 1944 was capable of providing, the product of years of accumulated knowledge about German military operational patterns. But the raw data was extraordinarily valuable as a starting point, and one of the specific conclusions that emerged from the analysis of the consumption data was a clearer picture of the sector where German ammunition allocation was being concentrated in the autumn of 1944. That concentration, visible in the supply data months before the offensive began, was consistent with what was later understood to be the preparation for the Ardennes offensive. The Bulge, as it became known, did not emerge from nowhere. It was built through months of logistical preparation, accumulating fuel, ammunition, and equipment at the specific locations in the German rear area from which the offensive would be launched. And some of that logistical preparation left traces in the supply chain data that the captured documents helped to illuminate. This is a particularly delicate claim to make carefully, because it risks overstating what was known and when. Allied intelligence in the autumn of 1944 did not predict the precise timing, location, or scale of the Ardennes offensive. The offensive achieved strategic surprise, but there is a difference between tactical and operational surprise, which was achieved, and strategic intelligence awareness of German logistical preparations, which was developing throughout the autumn. The captured supply chain documents were one component of an intelligence picture that was gradually accumulating evidence of unusual German logistical activity in the Ardennes sector, even if that evidence was not assembled into a clear warning before the offensive launched. Post-war analysis, with the benefit of complete access to both Allied intelligence records and German operational documents, confirms that the evidence was there to be read. The question of why it wasn't read correctly is a separate and complex one that involves assumptions about German capabilities, institutional biases within Allied intelligence about what the Germans could and couldn't achieve at that stage of the war, and the inevitable information overload that affects any intelligence system during an active campaign. The captured train documents were one thread in a complex tapestry, and like many of the threads, their significance was only fully apparent in retrospect. What is clear, and what the post-war analysis does confirm, is that the detailed understanding of German Western ammunition supply chain logistics that emerged from the exploitation of those documents contributed to Allied operational planning in the months following their capture in ways that were concrete and significant. Bombing targets were identified and prioritized differently. Supply choke points were understood more precisely. The pattern of German logistical behavior in specific sectors of the front was monitored with greater sophistication. And when the Ardennes offensive did occur, the understanding of German supply limitations that had been developed through the autumn informed both the initial response to the offensive and the longer-term confidence that the offensive could not be sustained. There is a particular irony in the fact that the German plan for the Ardennes offensive depended critically on capturing Allied fuel supplies. The Germans knew they did not have sufficient fuel to sustain the offensive through to its objectives. The plan assumed, or rather gambled, that Allied fuel dumps in the path of the advance would be captured intact and used to keep the offensive moving. That gamble reflected, in part, the degree to which German logistical planning had become dependent on capturing enemy supplies, rather than maintaining its own. And that dependency was itself a consequence of the pressure that the Allied bombing campaign, informed in part by the kind of intelligence that the captured train documents provided, had placed on German supply infrastructure throughout the preceding months. The offensive failed to capture sufficient Allied fuel. It stalled, and it was then pushed back by an Allied counter-response that was, among other things, informed by an understanding of German supply constraints that made it clear the offensive had a finite operational horizon. The Bulge was held and then reversed, and the German military's ability to mount any further significant offensive action in the West was exhausted in the process. There is, finally, something worth saying about what this story means beyond its specific historical context. The incident of the captured train is memorable as a story, a dramatic windfall of intelligence from an unexpected source. But the deeper lesson it carries is not about dramatic windfalls. It's about the unglamorous, systematic work of understanding systems. Military systems, supply chains, administrative networks, these are not abstract strategic concepts. They are collections of people making decisions under pressure, following procedures that erode under stress, generating documentation that tells stories they didn't intend to tell. Understanding those systems, reading the stories embedded in their paperwork and their patterns and their rhythms, is one of the most consequential forms of intelligence work. It's not glamorous. It rarely makes headlines. It doesn't have the dramatic appeal of a spy walking in from the cold, or a code being broken in a single brilliant moment. But it wins wars. The analysts who sat with those captured documents in the autumn of 1944 and carefully, methodically extracted everything they could from them were doing the same kind of work that good logisticians and analysts do in every conflict and in many non-military contexts as well. They were reading a system, they were finding the connections between the visible and the hidden, they were building a map of something that had been deliberately obscured, and they were doing it not through some single brilliant insight, but through patient, rigorous, disciplined analysis of everything the documents contained. The train driver who took the wrong route on a compromised stretch of track did not know what he was carrying. He didn't know that the paperwork stacked in his cab contained a partial map of one of the Third Reich's most critical operational systems. He was just a tired man trying to get from one place to another in the middle of a war that was falling apart around him. But what he carried, and what happened to it when it fell into the right hands, shaped the final months of the greatest conflict in human history in ways that reverberate through every serious study of military logistics and intelligence to this day. And that is the story of how one exhausted man in a train cab, through no particular intent or heroism of his own, handed Allied intelligence, something that all the spy networks and aerial reconnaissance programs and cryptographic breakthroughs of the war had not been able to provide in the same form or at the same moment. A picture of the system behind the guns. A map of the machine that was feeding Hitler's last Western campaign. A window, briefly open, that the right people looked through and saw clearly. The war in the West did not end because of that single moment. Nothing in history ends because of a single moment, but that moment was one of the threads from which the ending was woven, and now you know it was there. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the stories behind the stories, the intelligence that shaped the campaigns, the human decisions that turned the tide in ways that don't always make it into the popular histories, then subscribe, because there are a lot more threads where this one came from.